So after months of waiting, the OLED Switch is finally here. Again, this is not the Pro Switch that a lot of us speculated might manifest, but still a pretty decent upgrade. I think most people can agree, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I am so happy that I now have the OLED Switch in my hands and can actually check it out. And I was actually out of town hanging out with my buddy Ben in Austin doing a bunch of horror Halloween stuff when it came out. So as much as I enjoy spending time with my friend out there, I also really hated that I had to wait a little bit longer to get my hands on the OLED Switch. And the entire time I was out there and just kind of hanging out in airports trying to travel back to Columbus, I spent time with the original Switch that I had, and I just kept thinking about how much better Curse of the Moon 2 would look were I playing it on the OLED. But now I don't have to worry about that anymore, because now I'm back in Columbus and I've spent about the past week or so just playing the OLED Switch to death, whether it was Metroid Dread, some older titles where I just wanted to see what the colors would look like on that gorgeous screen. And that's what I wanted to do today, was just kind of talk about what my experience has been like with the OLED Switch, the things that I like about it, the things that I don't necessarily like about it, and whether or not I think it's right to upgrade, because I think there were about 4 upgrade scenarios that I kind of went through, and I thought 2 of them made sense, yes, to upgrade, and 2 of them maybe not so much. But we'll go ahead and get to that. For right now, let's just take a closer look at the OLED Switch and talk about some of the things that I really like about it, and some of the things that I don't really like that much about it, but ultimately aren't deal breakers. So the first most obvious draw would be to talk about just how tasty that OLED screen is on the OLED Switch. But before I do that, let's talk a little bit about the size of the screen first, because it is about 0.8 inches bigger than the old one. It is a 7-inch screen, and it's one of those things that on paper you look at and you're like, well, it's not that significant of a move, but whenever you actually have it in practice and you have the device in hand, it actually is a lot more comfortable to look at. It kind of reminds me of the difference between an iPhone Pro and an iPhone Pro Max, where there's not a massive difference in the screen size. You know, it's not like you're jumping up to an iPad mini size for that Pro Max upgrade, but the difference is just enough that it is significant and you do notice it in your day-to-day viewing, and it really is a more comfortable viewing experience. Now, in terms of the audio experience, they did improve the speakers on the Nintendo Switch. It is definitely louder than the original. However, just because the audio is louder doesn't necessarily mean it's better. At least in a few of the games that I tested whenever I played it at full volume in handheld mode, yes, it was noticeable that the audio was definitely louder, but at the same time it almost seemed a little bit distorted or a little bit tinny at the high end, which I guess is to be expected given the form factor. But at the same time, I think it's good to temper your expectations and realize that, you're not going to get, a significant bass boost or anything like that to the speakers. It's not going to be necessarily like a warmer sound or anything like that. A nice inclusion to be sure, but not a significant upgrade over the speakers from the original Switch. Going around the rear of the unit, this has to be one of the most talked about features that I've seen people praising the OLED Switch for, and that is the improved kickstand. And having now tried it myself, it is so much better than the original Switch. It's not even comparable. I mean, with the original Switch, a stiff breeze would blow that thing over, not to mention that the kickstand could be snapped off fairly easily. Yes, you could put it back, but that's not the kind of design move that inspires a lot of confidence for a handheld gaming device. Meanwhile, the new kickstand functions like an absolute dream. You can essentially position it at any angle that you find comfortable, and once you get it into that position, the unit feels absolutely solid. Now, like any device with mechanical moving parts, there's some concern that I have that on a long enough timeline, maybe it won't be able to hold its position as well, and it won't be quite as stiff and sturdy whenever you finally get it propped up the way that you want it, but that's something we won't really know until these devices have been tested for months or years. But for now, in the present moment, if you're somebody who likes to play in tabletop mode with Joy-Cons detached, you will find a significant improvement here. Another thing that I really like about the OLED Switch is that they did go for like a matte plastic finish for the rear housing of it, which does give it a little bit more of a texture, and it does feel a little bit grippier in some sense. And it seems to carry the added benefit of being less of a fingerprint magnet than the plastic that was used on the original Switch. Yeah, it's a small thing, but it does make the overall package feel a little bit nicer. Another thing Nintendo did here that I appreciate is it appears that they've improved the Joy-Con rail system on the sides. Whenever you have the Joy-Con snapped in, they just feel a lot more solid than they did in the original Switch units. On the original Switch, whenever I slid the Joy-Cons in, I could feel a little bit of flex there, and you can actually see a more prominent gap between the Joy-Cons and the system itself. And maybe over time I'll see the same thing happening here, but at least initially, it feels a lot more solid in the hand, and I would say that's true of the Switch OLED overall, is that the whole thing just feels a little bit more premium. And beyond the enhancements that I've already mentioned, it also doubles the internal storage from 32GB to 64GB, which is not a massive amount of storage or anything like that, but it's still nice if you wanted to download a few extra games to store digitally on the system. And finally, undeniably the biggest draw of the OLED Switch system, as its namesake suggests, is that beautiful OLED screen. And let me tell you, it is a stunner. Initially, I did jump directly into Metroid Dread as just a quick teaser of what was to come in terms of the inky blacks and the vivid colors that you could expect from the OLED Switch, but then quickly I decided to cycle through a few other games to kind of see games that were more vivid in nature and how they would appear on the screen, and just about every game that I popped in looked totally gorgeous. I spent a little bit of time with Borderlands 2, I spent some time with Doom 3, I tried some of the Mario games, and in every scenario the screen is an absolute delight, and for different reasons. For example, a very dark game like Doom 3 that leans heavily on shadows and environmental lighting definitely makes better use of the fact that you can actually see the screen go completely black in shadowed areas. And on the flip side, games that feature more candy-coated environments like Super Mario 3D World really just pop on that screen. And something else that I thought was interesting about the OLED screen is some people said it tended to have more of a greenish hue, although it looks like Nintendo offsets this by default. If you dig into the system settings for the OLED Switch, there is an option to either have just a standard color or a more vivid colorscape. So if you prefer truer colors, you could go ahead and enable that option, but I personally opted to leave the default of vivid colors in place because I just like that really saturated look. Now, it's true that that may not be the most accurate representation of the graphics in the games that you're playing, but it's really just a matter of personal preference, and again, personally, as somebody who prefers a warmer, more saturated look, I opted to just go ahead and leave it as it was. And Nintendo could not have chosen a better game than Metroid Dread to launch along with this new system, because it really kind of gives you a taste of both worlds. On the one hand, colorful flora and fauna, alien life forms, particle effects, and Samus herself really pop colorfully on the OLED screen. But then all of these dazzling colors are just further highlighted by the fact that all of the black levels appear truly black whenever you're staring at the screen. If you have the thing on and displaying anything that is black like a title screen, it just looks like the screen is off, it's so dark. And I think what makes the experience even better is that the border or the bezels that kind of surround the screen are done in a glossy black finish, which sort of creates this weird infinity effect where it sort of looks like the blacks that you're already seeing on screen just sort of roll into the housing of the system, and if you're playing in a darkened room, it is just absolutely awesome. In fact, it was so fun for me to just go back and look through a bunch of older Switch games and see how they now look on this brighter screen that I probably spent more time than I should have just filming the unit in handheld mode, and I had a blast doing it just because, again, that screen is so pretty. Now, there's not a lot that I don't like about the OLED Switch, but there are a few things that kind of stuck out to me. One are the buttons on top of the system, namely the cartridge slot is a little bit harder to open than the original Switch was, but then the trade-off there is that the cart does feel more secure when it's in the unit, so it's kind of hard to be mad about. And the same is true of the volume buttons. They feel more secure, but they are so flush and almost like recessed into the top of the unit that it is very difficult to feel by touch, whether or not you're on the volume up, volume down, or maybe the power button. I mean, the power button's a little bit more distinct, but if you're trying to feel by touch to adjust the volume, if you're playing in a darkened room, it's kind of annoying to try to feel around and try to, to increase or decrease the volume to an appropriate level. Hardly a deal breaker, but it is noticeable. And the other thing that gives me pause is it doesn't look like they've done anything to improve the Joy-Cons that I'm aware of. I don't think I've seen any reports where they massively reworked the internals or did anything to further address the drift issues that have kind of plagued those controllers since the system's launch. So that's kind of a bummer. Although I suppose you could forego using Joy-Cons entirely and just opt for something like the Split Pad Pro if you wanted more comfort in your portable gaming anyways. But yeah, overall I would say these are pretty minor criticisms lobbed against what is overall a stellar package. So then the question becomes, should you pick up the OLED Switch? And I think the answer is a big maybe, depending on a few different scenarios that I kind of went through. The first one is this going to be your first Switch system? If so, absolutely. It is 200% worth the extra $50 to have a larger screen that is OLED laden with a more solid kickstand and really just better build quality all around. The other scenario that I considered is, should you upgrade if you are on an original Switch? And I would say also yes, maybe. And that really goes one of two ways. The first is if you're on an original Switch, like the one that came out from 2017, I don't know about you, but mine had definitely taken a beating over a while, and ultimately over time those Joy-Cons get a little bit looser, and to me it's just such a solid offering overall, and the added benefit of the OLED screen to me makes it worth it. However, if you just bought a Switch recently, if you have the one with the improved battery that launched after that original Switch and you just got it in the last few months, you might want to hold off because there are still rumors that a Switch Pro might manifest at some point, and if you already dropped $300, it might be annoying for you to drop $350 when you just got a Switch. Granted, you will have a much better portable play experience, but again, if you just spent $300 on it, and especially if you play predominantly in docked mode anyways, I don't think there's enough of a draw here that you have to run out and buy an OLED Switch. And finally, should you upgrade to it if you're coming from the Switch Lite? And I would say probably not. My guess would be that if you're playing on a Switch Lite already, it's because you appreciate the comfort and portability of it, and this system just gets a little bit larger. And even though, yes, it does have a beautiful screen that definitely outperforms what you would see from the Switch Lite, if that's not the most important thing to you, then you probably don't need to worry about updating to the OLED Switch if, again, you are focused primarily on the comfort and portability of the smaller form factor of the Switch Lite. All that being said, as a chronic early adopter, I'm so glad that I picked up this system because, again, if you're somebody who plays portable mode a lot of the time with a regular Switch form factor, it is a gorgeous upgrade. There is no denying it. But hey, what about you? What are your thoughts on the OLED Switch? Do you think that it's a worthy upgrade and successor to the original, or do you think you're going to hold out for a Switch Pro if that ever does come out, like a mid-generational refresh that is more powerful and has beefier internals? I would love to hear your thoughts and your experience with the OLED Switch if you did go ahead and pick it up, so please let me know in the comments below. Would love to talk about it with you. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to watch. Always appreciate it. Have an awesome day, and I'll see you on the next video.